Hello everybody, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining once again. Hopefully tonight we're going to have pictures and sound, and for those who are asking, yes, and beer as well. Pictures and sound because I bought a brand new cable to link the camera to the laptop, which I think was the problem last time. So far should be working good. Fingers crossed. And you can hear me, so amazing. So listen, we've got loads to talk about because I don't know about you, but I thought the Spanish Grand Prix was pretty good for a Spanish Grand Prix. We can't always say that, can we? And I thought there was loads of action, loads to keep us entertained on the edge of our seat. So I want to know what you think. I spent the weekend commentating on the entire event for the BBC, which for me means that I'm engrossed in every single bit of it, from the very start of the weekend, right the way through, all the way to the closing laps and then beyond. And, for me, that's the dream. It genuinely is a dream job to have somebody pay you to zone in to their finest detail, to cover every single lap that's driven and to talk about it and share the emotion and the action and the drama to those people listening is an amazing job for me. I loved every second of it. So if you're listening, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it too. But if you were watching it or however you were watching it, I want to know your thoughts on the Spanish Grand Prix. I thought it was a good one, as I say. So we'll get into all of that. We'll get into the Charles Leclerc breakdown and the reliability issues, a multitude of issues at Red Bull that we need to cover. The fact that Max had his sort of unforced error, his spin, the fact that he had his DRS issue, and that wasn't the only one, was there? It was Lewis Hamilton had DRS issues. I think the Haas had DRS issues as well, so that was an issue over the weekend. Then we had Max screaming at his own team because the DRS wasn't working, and then of course, right come the end of the race, we had the team orders thing, and we'll get into all of that, and then of course, as we all know, Max won the Grand Prix. So let's start wherever you guys want to start. A lot of you jumping straight in on the team orders thing, so maybe we'll go there first, shall we? It doesn't really matter what order we cover it in. I will just try and answer and discuss as many points as you want to bring up. But I can see the word Checo popping up all over the place right now. So let's start there. Team orders at this early stage of the season, right or wrong? Well, let's have your thoughts on that while I give you mine. Personally, I think there's two ways to look at it, because from a fan's perspective, of course we don't want to see that. Of course we want to see the drivers given their shot. We want to see them, let them race. We want to let them go for it. We want to see a fair competition. But I always have to look at these things from the perspective of the team. And if I was running that team, I probably would have done the same thing. And you can agree or disagree on that. But the teams have to view this very differently to you and I watching from home, because we're looking at this from a point of view where we want entertainment. We want sporting competitiveness and fairness and the action that comes from all that. The team don't care who wins. The team just want to get the best result for the team, and they want the best result that's going to give them the best opportunity in the championship. I think it's fair to say that Max is the driver in that team that has the best shot at the championship, and if they were to lose out by just a few points come the end of the season, they'd be kicking themselves for not making that decision. And my other point on all of that is that I actually think Max would have probably got past anyway had they let them fight. But if they'd done that, they introduce a massive amount of perhaps unnecessary risk. So for me, it was the right call, even though I'm well aware it won't be a popular one. Let's see what you think. Checo will have to leave RBR. I don't think he will he? Does Checo really not know what he went into when he walked into Red Bull Racing? I appreciate it feels unfair, particularly in the moment. It must have felt heartbreakingly unfair for him. But he knows his role, and he hasn't been able to deliver to the same extent as Max so far this season. Massive deficit in points to his teammates, and so I think it's a sort of expected situation. Maybe more so at Red Bull than many other teams, but I think a couple more races in and every other team would be doing exactly the same thing, given the points distance, given the championship status, what's at stake, how much competition there is outside their own team. I think, for me, as I say, probably the right decision. Gavin Kidd says it's too early in the season, surely. HICM, 1 of 12, says Checo knows what it's like to be a number 2 driver. Yeah, well, he certainly does now. Too early in the season, says Will White. 6 of 22 races is way too early. Right, it's the right decision, seeing as Ferrari were out otherwise. Otherwise, it was wrong to use team orders. So listen, it's going to be a mixed opinion, isn't it? I think that's what I'm taking from this. There seems to be, fair mix of opinions on this, and I think that's understandable. I think you can look at it from lots of different ways. As I said, I'm taking the viewpoint from a team because it's a team that makes that decision. I'm understanding why they made that decision. I also understand the perspective of fans where they think that's unfair. They feel like they've been robbed. They feel like Checo's been robbed. And all of those viewpoints are valid. But from a team perspective, it feels like the right thing to do. There's an awful lot at stake. There we go. Checo would have been out of F1 without Red Bull, says Danny. And also a fair point. He was on the brink of leaving the sport. Red Bull gave him his opportunity. I don't think that's necessarily the reason he should just be able to do whatever the team ask him to do. But if he was quicker than Max, he'd get the opportunities. He's not been quicker than Max, and therefore Max gets the preferential treatment. That kind of is how Formula One works. And even if teams and drivers set out with the very best and fairest intentions, giving both of their drivers the very most equal of opportunities, ultimately then it will come down to the driver. And if one driver does better than the other, puts themselves in a better position, obviously normally that happens later into the season, but there's a very clear number one and number two in terms of performance between Max Verstappen and Checo Perez. Ultimately, that means the team will always end up favouring the driver that has the best opportunity in the championship because that will work for them. Right, surely went into Red Bull with his eyes open, says for English lies. Yeah, I think he did. I think he knows his position in the team. I think he feels like he has a shot at winning races, and he does have a shot at winning races. But I think yesterday it was the right call, as I say. Listen, we can agree to disagree. If you don't follow my viewpoint on that one, that's absolutely fine. Shall we move it on? Because there were so many other talking points around the Spanish Grand Prix. Where on earth do you want to go next? I mean, should we stay with Red Bull, as we've started on that point, and let's talk about Max Verstappen for a moment. Brilliant drive after his spin. It wasn't flawless, of course, but because he did have that unforced spin, which has to go down as driver error. They put it down to sort of gusty wind at that particular corner, and it was Carlos Sainz, wasn't it, that suffered an almost identical spin at the very same point in the racetrack. So gusty wind, I guess, could be given as a reason, but most drivers managed to get around absolutely fine. So it's got to go down as a driver error, which is unusual for Max, I think that's fair to say. But after that, he recovered well. There was one moment where Max was stuck behind George Russell, if you remember, struggling to get past because his DRS flap wasn't opening or was opening intermittently. And it was that frustrating period where he was stuck behind him for so long, had a faster car, but just couldn't get past, couldn't get close enough, couldn't get the speed differential down that straight without DRS. So that's the first point. We still need DRS. That was a very clear example of that. We need DRS still in this sport. We've talked for a long time about can we get rid of it in 2022 with these cars to allow each other to follow more closely and come out of corners more closely. Of course, the end goal would be to get rid of DRS. But right now, yesterday was a very clear example that at that particular circuit, we definitely need it. So I'm not against it in that sense. But Max didn't have it, so he was stuck behind him for ages. But then what happened was George pulled into the pits and Max did the same thing, which seemed like a really strange decision. Normally in that scenario, you'd be telling the driver in second place to do the opposite of the car in front. So if George pits, Max, you stay out. Just get a couple of clear laps without him holding you up to push as fast as you can and try and open up a small gap, or at least create a tyre offset that you can use later on in the race. If George were to stay out, of course, Max, you come into the pits. Same thing, we create a tyre offset, we can go for an undercut and we can use that extra performance on the outlap to find our way past. But they didn't do either of those things, they stuck behind him. It's obviously a moot point now because he ended up winning the Grand Prix, but that felt like a slight potentially missed opportunity. And of course they created themselves a new one at the second round of pit stops. But had that been a one-stop race, I think they'd have struggled a lot more in that sense. So strange one, not sure quite how that happened, but they'll analyse it and maybe I've got it wrong and they absolutely knew what they were doing, but it seemed like a weird one on paper. So that was that. But then Max, of course, drove a brilliant race to go on and win the Grand Prix. And I don't think anyone can argue with that. He was faultless after that early fault. But he did a very good job of running the majority of that Grand Prix. So any thoughts on Max Verstappen from any of you? Max wasn't always within 1 second of Russell. A mental weak phase. Well, I think, look, when he knew he didn't have his DRS operational, perhaps the drive to get to within 1 second, the desire and the motivation to get to within 1 second, where you start to hurt your tyres more, becomes slightly less of an issue. But also, let's take nothing away from George Russell, and we'll definitely get onto him and Mercedes in a moment. But what a great drive from George. Made his car incredibly difficult to get past, and that was genuine, great defensive driving. Made life very difficult for Max and made him very, very frustrated, to the point where we had Max screaming on the radio, levelling incompetence at his own team for not getting the DRS flap operational. And I joked yesterday in commentary that it's all very well Max screaming at the team that they have somehow messed up and can't get his DRS flap operational, and screaming almost abuse at his team. You never get it the other way around. You never get the team screaming at the driver because he messed up and threw a pretty decent position away on lap 4 when he spun with no other cars around him. So it always makes me chuckle and have a little wry smile when a driver feels like it's okay to come on and slag off the team because something hasn't worked perfectly, when they are far from perfect themselves. But anyway, maybe that's just me, my twisted sense of humour from being inside the team all those years ago. Russell was moving under braking. That was borderline. I don't think it was too unfair. He always left a gap. I mean, you are allowed to move one change of direction in the braking zone. I think there were a couple of occasions when, borderline it was 2, but he always left enough room. I didn't think there was anything that was too dangerous. I didn't think it was particularly beyond the rules. I thought it was always in and around the rules, which is a dangerous place to be as a driver. But I thought, I don't think it was too harsh. I think if he'd received a penalty, it would have felt very harsh. That would be my overriding opinion on that. Rian Castamans says, Max says we. Well, yes, he said we can't even manage to get a DRS flap working. I don't think he was referring to himself, though, was he? Look, it's emotion in the heat of the moment, and all drivers do it. I'm sure plenty of team members inside the garage may have been venting frustration when Max Verstappen spun. They just weren't doing it on the radio. So I'm not saying that emotion doesn't take over in the heat of the moment, because of course it does for everybody. It's an intense period of time in Grand Prix, and when something doesn't go well, or when it does go well, sometimes emotions bubble over the top. John Spencer says, great commentary yesterday. Thanks very much, John. Thanks for listening. As I say, really, really loved it. I'm back again for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix for more of the same. Right, shall we? We've got to cover We've got to cover Aston Martin. We'll definitely cover Mercedes. Have we covered off everything at Red Bull? Is there anything else to cover at Red Bull? Any more Red Bull chat? Don't think so. DRS. Let's just quickly touch on DRS. I can only assume that the DRS flaps were failing due to the heat. It was incredibly hot. Got up to about 36 or 37 degrees. On Sunday for race day. We saw DRS issues for Verstappen, Hamilton, definitely the Hasses. I think that might have been it, but an unusual number of DRS failures. I can only imagine it's heat related in some degree. Otherwise, hugely coincidental that so many teams had that problem. I don't think it'll be something that will hamper them further down the season. As long as they can find a way to understand it, they will be able to fix it very, very quickly. Monaco's only a week away, but quite frankly, DRS is almost pointless there anyway, isn't it? So even if they didn't fix it, I'm not sure it's going to hold them back. Right, let's move on from Red Bull then. Shall we go... Where do you want to go? Should we go Aston Martin? Let's go Aston Martin because that's linked to Red Bull. There's a nice segue there. The green Red Bull. Now, has anyone listened to my podcast yet? Out this morning, the Pit Lane Life Lessons podcast. I talk about exactly that in this week's audio podcast. You can find that anywhere you get your podcasts. just search Pit Lane Life Lessons and you'll find that. The green Red Bull, as it's been termed. Right, where do we start with this? First of all, let's start with where does this come from? Now, I'm sure most of you know the story that Dan Fallows, who was one of the chief technical people chief aerodynamicist at Red Bull, moved last year from Red Bull, had a period of gardening leave, but was actually released early from his gardening leave to be able to go and start work at Aston Martin before his full term of gardening leave was up. That was an agreement between the teams that Red Bull gave him permission to go and do. He then started working at Aston Martin, and somewhere between that point, Aston Martin have come up with a car, I mean, so similar in so many ways to the Red Bull, almost identical in many cases. There's two ways I think you can look at this. You can say that the rules nowadays are fairly prescriptive, and so there are maybe 2 or 3 main concepts in Formula One, and everybody has landed on one of those, and probably over time will all converge into something quite similar as the rules stabilise over the next few years. Maybe it's just a coincidence that the team ended up with something that seems very, very similar, because if you go down that particular path, the path that Red Bull went down, well, there's only one best way to manage that airflow over your side pods and onto your floor and around that central section of the car. So maybe just through a process of development, you end up with a very similar looking car, if that's the concept that you follow. But it's almost identical. So the other theory, and this is the theory that's doing the rounds and that Red Bull are concerned to some extent about, is that Dan Fallows and other people that have made that switch from Red Bull to Aston Martin in recent times will have taken a huge amount of knowledge with them to Aston Martin, and it's that knowledge, either whether just stored inside those personnel, the personnel's heads, or is there something more sinister afoot? Is there some intellectual property, some hard data, some drawings, some technical information being taken from one organisation and now has turned up in another? And that is the big question that Red Bull are now asking. Investigations, of course, will continue inside the team, probably at both teams, and maybe even furthermore at the FIA. Even though they've already had a little look at it themselves and cleared Aston Martin, I suspect this will rumble on a little bit further. Now, I have some experience in this field, as many of you will know. 2007, there was the Spygate scenario at McLaren, McLaren versus Ferrari. Now, very different situation, admittedly, but when that intellectual property, and that was a dossier of drawings that changed hands between a couple of people at Ferrari and at the very top of McLaren, when that information entered our organisation, the FIA, together with a set of digital forensic scientists, came in and seized every single computer, every single piece of computerized equipment in the entire building. My own laptop got seized during that period of time, and then it gets absolutely scanned, it gets investigated, looked through with a fine-tooth comb for any potential use of that information, for any knowledge of that information. If you've read my book, you will know there's a slightly comedic story around that, but I'll leave you to to figure that one out if you haven't yet looked at the book. But look, these are the kind of things that the FIA have available to them if they decide they want to go that far. Because this information is all digital, it's trackable, it's traceable. So if something was downloaded from the Red Bull servers, they know when that happened, they know where it happened, they know the ID of the various computers that it happened to. Similarly, Aston Martin, if something was uploaded at that end, the same process can apply. So this stuff is largely trackable and traceable if they need and feel they need to go that level of detail in this investigation. So I'd be amazed, quite frankly, if somebody in this modern day and age was, quite honestly, stupid enough to download data, drawings, information from one team, put it onto a hard drive and walk up the road to another team and then upload it. I think that'd be stupid. Everyone knows it would be stupid. I'd be amazed if anybody did it. So the other alternative is that information is just stored in somebody's head. And if you are a chief aerodynamicist, of course you're going to be absolutely key influential to shaping the design of that particular Red Bull. And if you were influential in that design process and then you go to another team, that's all going to be stored in here, isn't it? You're going to have the same thought process. If you thought it was the best way to manage airflow across the central section of a car at Red Bull, or when you go up the road and you're looking at designing a new car, you're going to have that same thought process. You're going to still think that's the best way to manage airflow over the central section of that car. So, of course, you're going to come up with a concept that's incredibly similar. And so I think this is a really difficult one to piece together or to pick apart. I think it's going to be one that upsets a lot of people, but to find some proof anywhere, it's such a grey area, muddy waters. I'm really not sure how you go about pursuing this to a point of finding somebody at fault, finding somebody to blame, finding a breach of regulations. I suspect that's going to be very, very tricky to do. It is very different to the pink Mercedes saga back in 2020 because, of course, they were a Mercedes customer. They actually had access to these brake ducts. They had a set in their possession, so they could easily copy them. It was a very, very different scenario. So, look, let me see what you guys say on that particular topic for now. Let me see, hold on. Fallows hasn't worked on the RB18 since June 21. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely, but in June 21, those concepts will have already begun happening. Those design ideas will have been tested, simulated way earlier than June 21st before he then left that team. So if he's the one leading that design process back in his Red Bull days last year, is going to be the one with all those ideas, with that influential thought process that of course he'll take stored in there with him to a new team. So I suspect that's probably where much of this happens. And it's not just down to Fallows. There are another couple of people that made similar switches who all have different aspects of that car locked in here. Okay, so and then here's the next, in fact I'll come back to that. The next question around this was, hang on a second. Aston design department is digital cameras and infrared cameras. Yeah, this isn't. Well, look, let's be clear. There's no inference that Aston Martin copied this from pictures. I mean, there's no way that can have happened because this car didn't break cover until long after the design will have been well underway. Even manufacture would have been underway at Aston Martin. So there's not even a suggestion that this has been done from photographs. There's just the time frames don't work with that. So it has to have come from somebody's ideas. Somebody must have had the same idea that they had at Red Bull. Whether that's a massive coincidence or it's the same person having the same ideas, just having moved teams in between, is perhaps something that will be deciphered over the coming months. Excuse me, I think that sounds like a helicopter coming over the top of my house, if you can hear that. So the next question that somebody's just said, and apologies, I've missed it, I've lost where it's gone. The next question, of course, is, God, that's loud. It feels like that helicopter's about to land on my roof. I would hope it's not, but can you hear that? I think it's a Chinook. Jesus, that's literally right over the top of my house. Anyway, oh yeah, blimey, that really is above the top of my house. Easy, I'm a chimney. Anyway, sorry about that. Okay, that was slightly terrifying. Right, where were we? Oh yes, I know what we're talking about, Aston Martin. So the next question was, even though they've gone to all this trouble, all this time, money out of their tightly restricted budget to come up with a car that has the same design profiles in many areas as the Red Bull, it didn't give them any performance advantage. In fact, they maybe even went backwards for a period of that weekend, didn't they? Whereas Red Bull are off getting a 1-2 in the race, Aston Martin, in the most part this weekend, were nowhere. So this is where I started talking about this topic in my podcast today, in that this isn't about bolting these bits onto the car, bringing this B-spec car to the racetrack this weekend and expecting it necessarily to catapult them forward up the grid. Of course, they'd love that to happen, but this is a much more longer-term view. This is about thinking in the same way that Mercedes did with their B-spec concept. If you remember, after the first pre-season test, that caused them so many problems up until just this weekend. It's about longer term thinking. It's about understanding the potential of this concept as opposed to the concept you had before. Appreciating or having an understanding that this new design idea has so much more longevity in terms of its development, has so much more potential there to unlock than perhaps the more restricted development path that the previous concept would have held for them. So given that the rules stay the same between 2022 and 2023, if they have an utter belief that this will lead to a longer term development path and therefore success, it's still the right decision, even though it may not have looked like it on day one when they brought it to the racetrack. And exactly the same applies to Mercedes. Mercedes have been struggling very publicly with a bouncing car, porpoising, struggling all the way through the first 6 races of this season because they had this concept on the car that didn't seem to work as well as the previous concept they had at the first test. But Mercedes stuck with it. And they stuck with it because they knew in the same way that this offered up longer term potential success, longer term potential opportunities if they manage to find a way to unlock that development. And that's exactly what they've done. They've taken time, they've stuck with it, they believed in it. They've now got, I think, to the bottom of these porpoising or bouncing issues in the most part, and now they can start the process of unlocking that development potential. And if that's the case, if that really is where they are, potentially this car could go a lot quicker, could move itself way further up the grid, perhaps has the most potential left in it of any of those cars on the grid at the front end. So that's the reason they've done it. That's why they've gone down these routes and stuck with these routes. It's not about instant success. It's about longer term success. It's about building for the future and looking further down the road where they think this will end up yielding results for them. So there you go. That I think has covered off Aston Martin. Let me know if you've got anything else. Could the Aston Martin lower performance be on purpose for a few races as to not arouse suspicion, says John D. I don't think so. I mean, look, suspicion's been aroused, hasn't it? Because the car looks identical to the Red Bull. So I don't think they're sneaking it under the radar by taking away performance on purpose. I think the suspicion's been aroused just because the car looks the same, and I honestly believe that Aston Martin will have gone into that, look, knowing that they're going to be arousing suspicion, there's going to be question marks around it, but they will have also gone into it with an utter belief that they are all above board. They haven't done anything wrong. They would not have committed this limited resource, to going down this development path if they felt there was any risk that it might be deemed illegal. That would be a massive waste of these limited budget resources they have this season. So they've got to be completely sure that they are above board in the way they've gone about this. And so I suspect if we take that as read, I suspect this will probably end up fizzling out over time. It's raising suspicions, it's asking questions, but I suspect they wouldn't be stupid enough to do something silly that would get them in a breach of the regulations in a year where you just have to be so careful about every single pound that you spend. Right, shall we go, as we've talked about, shall we go to Mercedes next, as we talked about Mercedes, didn't we? I thought Mercedes had an incredibly strong weekend. Not so much, I mean, the results, I guess, were great, weren't they? 3rd and 5th, decent team result for Mercedes so far this season. But even more than that, way more than that, read the body language of the team members this weekend. Listen to the driver interviews after the sessions as the weekend went on. These team members and these drivers have so much more confidence than they've had at any other race up until now. They feel like they've cracked it. They feel like they've got on top of the bouncing issues. They've understood it. They brought a raft of new upgrades, including a new floor with some specific tweaks to the floor to alleviate that bouncing effect that they were having. And it doesn't mean it won't come back at certain circumstances, at certain speed ranges, at certain circuits perhaps, but they know why it's happened now. And up until now, that's been one of the most baffling elements to them. They haven't been able to understand it, and now they do. So like a switch, now they can start unlocking performance. Because instead of fighting fires and constantly battling to get that under control, now they can start developing the car purely from a performance perspective. And that's something they haven't had the opportunity to do yet. After 6 races, now they are back in this hunt. Now, whether they've got any hope of winning a championship, I mean, look, it's a long shot, isn't it? I would never say never. But I think it's a massive, tall order, a big ask. However, now they have the opportunity to take on the others in what they would deem a much more fair fight. Yes, there are a few races behind. They've got some catching up to do, but their car might just have a lot more potential in it than the others have, given they've already been pushing the limits of development with their car in the first 5 or 6 races themselves. So, are Mercedes back? That's the title of this video. Let's answer the question. Are Mercedes back? I firmly believe they are, you know. I think they are back in the hunt for race wins. I think they're going to be back in the hunt for pole positions. It may not happen next time out. In fact, it could happen next time out. It's Monaco. Quite literally, it could happen next time out. It's a leveler anyway, and so if they can get their car hooked up, if they can get their drivers hooked up, there is way more performance or lap time around Monaco from a driver that gets themselves in the zone, that gradually over the weekend builds momentum, gains confidence, than there is in absolute car performance, than any tweaks you can do to setup or upgraded parts that you bring to the racetrack. This is a driver confidence circuit. And of course, yes, you need a good car underneath you, but if you've got a decent car, it's not going to be limited by aerodynamics. It's not going to be necessarily limited by engine performance or power unit performance. Your DRS is going to make very little difference. This is going to come down, in the most part, to having a driver that can continuously build as the sessions go through the weekend, maximising, peaking at the right moment, which is qualifying on Saturday afternoon. From there, if you can qualify on pole, you should have a cracking opportunity at winning that Grand Prix, as we well know. And I can't see that there's a reason why Mercedes could not put themselves in that position. Why not? Do you disagree? I think that Mercedes will be back after the summer break. They're not at Ferrari's and Red Bull's pace yet, says Tim Van Wingard. Well, look, I think that's a fair point. I don't think they are at a Ferrari and Red Bull's pace yet. But this was the first weekend. This was almost like the first weekend of the season for them. So I'm expecting tweaks. I'm expecting more understanding. The learning that came from getting 2 cars in this current configuration all the way around an entire Grand Prix weekend will have been massive. And if they can just start to fine-tune that, and as I say, Monaco, much less about car performance, much more about driver performance, just maybe there's an opportunity there. Then, of course, we go on to Baku, and that's going to be much more about straight line speed. I would fully expect Red Bull to have a significant advantage at that particular circuit, but things will have changed and moved on by then. But look, yeah, why not? Why can't Mercedes start to claw their way back into the fights for race wins? Maybe it'll come after the summer break. Maybe Tim's right, but maybe it could come sooner. Right. Let me see. Russell's a future world champion. I don't think too many people would disagree with you on that one. Marc, what brand of beer is that? It's Peroni. Not sponsored by Peroni, but if Peroni want to sponsor me, mate, I'll take it. Yeah, that's my favourite beer, Peroni. Right, Marc has the fastest engine in the engine freeze. So the rest of the car when the rest of the car gets there, it's a done thing, says Nutcracker. Do Marc have the fastest engine in the engine freeze? I think they definitely have one of the fastest, but yeah, I mean, maybe. I think it's very tight. We obviously don't know the absolute answers to that, but yes, they've got a very, very strong engine. But I also think Ferrari have a cracking engine right now, and quite frankly, so do Red Bull. So I don't think there's a huge amount in the differences between those 3 engines or those 3 power units. Maybe they do by small amounts, but it really isn't very much, if indeed they have. I think the bigger potential in 2022, of course, comes from getting the best out of these new regulations. And Mercedes have gone down a very different path to every other team on the grid. They've gone down this almost zero side pods, no pods. They're very slim side pods. It's a completely different way of packaging the car. They've done that for very good reason, because all of the data shows that works, that delivers performance for them. It's just that they haven't been able to unlock that yet. They haven't even been able to show that yet. They haven't been able to find that performance. But the bouncing, the porpoising that we've seen on the racetrack doesn't occur in the same way in CFD or even in the wind tunnel. It's a very difficult thing to replicate in those virtual scenarios. So if we take away the bouncing, which is kind of what they do in CFD and in the wind tunnel, clearly that concept is delivering extra performance. That's why they've stuck with it. So now they haven't got the bouncing to the same extent on the racetrack, they can maybe start unlocking some greater performance, potentially even than anyone else, given that they've got a very different concept. Will it work? Will it not? Only time will tell, but they have a firm belief that it's going to offer them some opportunities. Carluccio says, monetize your streams. I mean, very kind of you, but I'm just kind of doing this for fun. I think you probably did get an advert before you came on it, didn't you? I don't know. I think it is monetized. Not that it really makes me any money, and that really isn't the driving force behind it. But thank you for your concern. Right. Anything else on Mercedes before we move on? Well, let's quickly talk about George Russell. I think in our post-race podcast on the BBC yesterday, I put him down as my driver of the day. And I did that, not flippantly. I did that because I thought he had a faultless drive, really. I thought he was excellent when he was ahead of Max Verstappen, held him back for a long, long time, didn't he? I thought he drove very, very well. He was defending under massive pressure, but didn't put a foot wrong, didn't lock a wheel anywhere, didn't run wide, put in some blistering lap times at times. So I thought he drove an excellent race to get himself on the podium. I thought other contenders could have easily been Lewis Hamilton, who I think did win the official driver of the day. Checo, blistering drive from him, very unlucky, and as we talked about earlier, potentially unfair. He could have had driver of the day as well. So I thought there were a number of cases. You could even potentially argue that Charles Leclerc could have been driver of the day, even though he didn't finish the Grand Prix. He did nothing wrong. In fact, he did an awful lot right, and that was a heartbreaking moment when that Ferrari broke down. So perhaps we should talk about Leclerc. We haven't done that yet, have we? So I think that's Mercedes covered off, isn't it? Any further? Yeah, great drive by Lewis. Yes, couldn't agree more. Lewis came from last to fifth. That's your driver of the day, says Alex Lamas. Yeah, as I say, definite contender. Drove a very strong race after that early collision. Right, I think that's it for Mercedes. Let's talk about Charles Leclerc, because that lap on Saturday, for me, was a stunning lap of that racetrack. I mean, it came out of almost nowhere. We knew he was quick. We knew he had a car with definite potential to get himself across the line and get himself onto pole position. But the margin by which he did it, I thought, was blisteringly fast. And I know we've seen this season. We've seen the Ferrari have a very quick car on a Saturday, yet struggle to look after its tyres on a Sunday. And if you look at what Carlos Sainz was able to do, we take away his Saturday performance, which was quite some way off his teammate, but even on Sunday, and I definitely know there's caveats because he was way further down the pack, but his tyres disappeared incredibly quickly. If you think about that differential that Lewis Hamilton had over Carlos Sainz, yes, there was a tyre offset, but it was marginal. It wasn't very big. And yet look at the difference in performance that Lewis had over Carlos Sainz. Now, Carlos is in a quick car. Yes, Lewis has got a car that's definitely a lot quicker than it used to be, rather. But I thought Carlos was really struggling with tyre performance. And I wonder whether that might have affected Charles Leclerc had he been able to continue in the race. Of course, he's out front. Much easier to look after your tyres in that scenario. And also, don't forget, Charles Leclerc had no pressure after the Max Verstappen spin, so maybe he could have just nursed his tyres through that Grand Prix. But the Ferrari still has a weakness, which is on race day. It's keeping tyres alive. It's the lack of top speed, but also managing tyre performance and tyre life throughout the Grand Prix, where Red Bull seems to have a much better way of managing that on their particular car. Sainz just flew off the track. Yeah, same as Max. It was the same corner, wind or gust of wind that just caught him out. But as I said earlier, in the same way that it was for Max, got to go down as a driver error. And let's face it, Carlos Sainz has had a few of those over the course of the start of this season. He's got to get on top of it. It was a disappointing weekend, really, for Carlos, because he needs a solid one. Not only does he need a good weekend, he needs to beat his teammates. That little dynamic is turning out to be a one-horse race within that team, and whether anybody says it or not, and I don't think they will, people are starting to look, in current circumstances, at Carlos Sainz as the unofficial number 2 driver. He won't be termed that, it certainly won't be talked about, I'm sure, within the team, but as we start to get towards the business end of the championship, he is going to be asked to back up his teammates if the fight starts coming from Red Bull, potentially even Mercedes. Carlos will be there to do the job of bringing up the rear behind Leclerc, picking up the points, taking the points away from the others, and yet giving his teammate the opportunity to go for a world championship. Not a position that Carlos Sainz would have ever wanted to find himself in. Right. Likes, please, says David Kamel. Thank you. Yes, that would be great. Hit the like button. I'd appreciate that. Look, only 167 likes, and yet there's, what, 600-700 of you watching. Just do me a favour. Just smash like. Just do it now. It'd be great. It'll take you a second. I can even wait for you if you like. Go on. Hit it. Just like. Thank you. There you go. There you go. One person's done it. Thanks very much. Appreciate that. Sainz is in the same position as Checo. Is he in the same position as Checo? I mean, yes, there are similarities, absolutely. I think, yeah, look, there are similarities. I think you're right. I think Carlos has made more mistakes than Checo, probably. And I haven't got the stats on that, but it feels that way. I think Checo, at times, at certain racetracks, has been as quick as his teammate, but then probably so has Carlos Sainz. So, yeah, I guess there are similarities, absolutely. And as the season goes on, if those similarities continue, so will the way that those two drivers get treated from their own team, like I said. Right, oh yeah, look at you've all hit the button. Thank you. Well, you all haven't. Still lots of you haven't hit the like button, so, you know, crack on. But thank you for those that have. Appreciate that. Right, where else do we go? Okay, listen, I think we've covered the big teams, haven't we? Where else do you want to go? So you start firing some questions at me, and I will do what I can to answer them. Here we go. Rakatata4 says, McLaren's performance was nowhere. And you know what? He's absolutely right, really, isn't he? Because McLaren bought a massive raft of upgrades to this race. One of the biggest packages, I think, of all of the teams to the Barcelona Grand Prix. Some of those, they have brought new brake ducts, which have been a bit of an Achilles heel for them. They've had a kind of part fix to their brake duct problem. If you remember, it was something that held them back in pre-season testing a lot. And they came up with a sort of in-the-field fix or a temporary fix to get them out of that problem. But I think it was a compromise. This weekend, they brought the real fix, the fix that was going to not only give them their brake cooling that they needed, but also deliver the performance that those components helped to deliver as well. And yet it didn't really work to the same extent. So they've got a lot of work to do, but it could well be a little bit like the Aston Martin, a bit like the Mercedes, that they've just got to get their heads around why it didn't work. They believe there's potential in that upgrade package, which of course they must do. Perhaps they just haven't found it yet. But it was a disappointing weekend. Disappointing for Daniel Ricciardo. He qualified ahead of his teammates and yet finished quite a long way back. I appreciate there were various reasons in terms of his strategy, the traffic that he got stuck behind. But even so, he, like Carlos Sainz, needs a really solid result against his teammates to stop the rot, to stop that becoming an even bigger problem. Not just outside from the team, outside of his own team and the people looking on, but also inside his own mind. That confidence that Daniel has is going to start to wane away if he can't find a way to overturn that deficit to his teammate, and on a consistent basis too. And he just hasn't found the way to get the best out of that car yet. So I hope that he picks it up. I hope he gets it together. I hope the team find the performance that they need, because it felt like a really disappointing weekend from a McLaren perspective. Is De Vries getting Williams' seat next season, says Lewis Nichols. Yes, I think there's a very strong rumour that could well happen. So De Vries, you'll have seen, ran FP1 for Williams, currently a Mercedes contracted driver, but he was slotted into the Williams for FP1 to do that session. And there is a lot of talk about him potentially replacing Nicholas Latifi. There were rumours that could even happen before the end of the season. But of course, don't forget, Latifi brings a considerable sum of money to the team, so it's a little bit more complicated than just choosing a driver on performance. So it may well be that doesn't change, nothing changes until the end of the season. Given where Williams are, perhaps the money, the stability that Latifi brings them, if they can see that out to the end of the season, maybe that's the best way, and that's probably what they'll end up doing, I guess. But it was interesting to see him in that car, and I thought he did a great job. Absolutely did a solid job, didn't he? Outran his teammate in that particular session. Didn't make any major mistakes. They were comparative in terms of car configuration, as far as I know, and run plan. So that felt like a relatively genuine time that De Vries set over Latifi in FP1. So look, he put a good showing together, and that will do him no harm moving forwards, I'm sure. Kiwi says, I think De Vries may well get into the Williams during the summer break. Could well happen, as I say. Lots of rumours around that. So let's see. Has the Dream Car series finished? Yes, last show tonight. If you've been watching Wheeler Dealer's Dream Car, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. But if you've been watching it on the Discovery Channel, the last show went out tonight. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope we enjoyed. I was going to say we enjoyed making it. We actually didn't enjoy making it too much because that show is an absolute killer. So many cars going through the show. It's incredibly hard work, which is why we're not rolling straight into another one. We are taking a little break from that because it's a logistical nightmare. However, the show, I think, has turned out brilliantly. So if you've watched it, thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed it, then I'm really pleased. And thank you for all of the messages and love that everyone sent, both Mike Brewer and I, off the back of that. Because, it's turned out to be a really nice show. Amazing feel-good moments at the end of every single one of those episodes. If you haven't seen it, you can, of course, find it on the Discovery Plus app. Or, if you're a massive cheapskate, you'll find it on Quest in about a year's time. Right. So, where else are we going to go here then? How long have we got left? 10 minutes or so. Elvis, do you think Aston Martin were right in replacing Otmar with Martin Whitmarsh? So, they didn't actually replace Otmar with Martin Whitmarsh. He's come in a very different role. So, Martin Whitmarsh is the sort of overarching CEO. I don't know what his actual title is. Is he chairman or CEO or managing director or something like that? Otmar was the team principal. So Otmar has actually been replaced with Mike Crack. But yes, I think there was definitely some conflict when Martin Whitmarsh came into the team between him and Otmar. If you read between the lines, Otmar suggests that whilst he'd been in charge of that team solely for a long period of time, Martin came in his role, and I guess there was a conflict of power, of position, and of influence within that team, and it kind of bubbled into something that wasn't particularly nice and wasn't going to survive. And so Otmar, of course, as we know, left. But yeah, I mean, I think, look, were they right or not? I guess only time will tell. Martin Whitmarsh has a lot to offer a Formula One team. Of course, I know him well. I've worked with him. He's a very clever man, he's a great man, and he's a good friend, I would class him as now. I think he's somebody I have a lot of respect for, so he will and can do a very good job. He'll be thinking bigger picture than just the daily running of a team, which of course is what the likes of Otmar Safnauer and now Mike Crack had the responsibility for. So Martin Whitmarsh is a much bigger player in terms of the strategic direction that that team will go. So slightly different roles, I guess. Right. Right. With the aim for cars to lose weight, would you be excited for refueling to return, says Giorgio Rapetti. The refueling debate is one that, well, it's been running for years, hasn't it? And I've been part of refueling teams, of course. I've been part of teams once refueling had left. What do I think of refueling? Look, I'm not against it. It was exciting for me to be part of a pit stop when we had refueling. I spent some time on the refueling rig in pit stops, and that was great. It adds a slightly different strategic element to the race, and I quite enjoyed that because I'm a strategic guy. I enjoy the strategy within Formula One. But if you look at Formula One during the refueling era, there was actually hardly any overtaking on the racetrack, because nobody bothered doing overtaking on the racetrack because they knew they could do it in the pits with completely different offset fuel strategies. And I think that didn't really add to the racing. I don't think it adds to the spectacle that we want to see as fans. I think what we want to see is, if you want to get past somebody, you kind of got to do it on the racetrack. And of course, that's what we're aiming for with the cars that we've got right now. I'm not sure refueling is going to add to that. In fact, it could even take away from that, because the risk involved in going for a lunge on the brakes to get an overtake done, as opposed to just pulling in and offsetting your fuel strategy, is a no-brainer. So you'd go for the refueling offset as a way to get past your main rival, rather than going for the big risk on the racetrack. So I think it has pros and cons, but for me, if you look at how the racing was under refueling, I'm not sure it was great. So I'd be hesitant to want to bring that back as a means to try and improve the sport. Refueling's too dangerous. Yes, there's an element of that. Of course, there is a danger element to refueling. I didn't actually buy that necessarily as the biggest reason to stop it, because whilst there is a danger element, there's also a massive danger element to a car tearing into a pit stop area at 60 miles an hour. That's scary. It's terrifying. Formula One is dangerous. Refueling, you're sitting in a car as a driver. Essentially, you're sitting on a bomb. You're sitting on a massively flammable, explosive material right behind where the driver is. And right behind that fuel tank is an exhaust that's glowing red hot. So yes, there's danger clearly in that setup, in that scenario, but we've developed these cars to now become so safe in that regard that almost never do we see a fire based around fuel. It almost never happens. So I fully believe that we could reintroduce refueling in a completely safe way if we wanted to do it. I just don't think it's the right thing for the sport. Right, where else? Right, Tsunoda beating Gasly this year. I'm calling it, says Thomas Pacheco. Don't know, he could do, couldn't he? I think he's just not been consistent enough for me, Tsunoda. I think he has flashes of brilliance, and I really like the guy. I want to see him do well. I think he's an exciting driver, but he's not been consistent enough. Gasly, we know what he can do. He's a brilliant driver on his day, but he's also struggled a little bit with that car in certain scenarios. So that's a team I think is maybe that car's a difficult one to drive. Maybe it's got sort of peaky performance in a very narrow performance window, and if you're not in it, you're absolutely nowhere. If you are in it, you can have a competitive drive. Maybe that's what's going on at that team. Right. Do you think that Red Bull started with fuel not being on temperature? No idea. Tim, let me know why you think that. Have I missed a story today? I'm not sure. Is that something doing the rounds? Is that a rumour? I'd love to know why you think Red Bull had their fuel not at the right temperature when they started the race. Don't know the answer to that one. Opinions about Mick. Mick Schumacher, I think he's got great potential as a driver. I'd have liked to see that potential kind of come to fruition a little bit sooner than now. But I do also think we've got to caveat all of this stuff by looking at even some of the most experienced drivers on the grid. The Daniel Ricciardos, the Carlos Sainz, the Lewis Hamiltons even. this particular year who are struggling at times to get the best out of their cars. And so if they're finding it hard to adapt to these new types of cars and the new driving style that has to be adapted to go with these new types of cars, it's perfectly understandable to say that somebody like Mick Schumacher could be having the same kind of issues. We judge these drivers, of course, on their performance, on their lap times and on their results, but actually, are we saying that Lewis Hamilton is suddenly not as good a driver anymore? I don't think anyone's saying that. I think we're saying that Lewis Hamilton had a difficult car and he's struggling to adapt his driving style to get the best out of that car in the same way that George Russell has. Does that mean George Russell's a better driver than Lewis Hamilton? I don't think anyone's saying that. But you have to remember that when you get a new type of car, some of those characteristics might just suit a little bit more the style of one driver to another. And of course, a great driver has to be able to adapt, but that can take time. I've used the analogy of having to learn to write with your left hand if you're right-handed. You may have spent your entire career writing with your right hand, and all of a sudden someone comes along and says, right, this year you've got to write with your left. Well, you know how to write, you're an excellent writer, but you've never done it with your left hand before. Now that's an extreme analogy, but if you've had a career where your driving style is your USP, that's the thing that makes you brilliant, and you know how to drive a racing car. Lewis Hamilton knows how to drive a racing car. Daniel Ricciardo knows how to drive a racing car. What he hasn't been able to do is change the way he's driven throughout his entire career, because these new cars have a slightly different way of getting the best out of them. He's finding it more difficult than his teammate is. Daniel Ricciardo is doing the same, and maybe somebody like Mick Schumacher is having the same kind of issues. So I think we need to give these drivers a little bit of breathing space when we start judging them too quickly. Of course, it's natural. That is how we judge racing drivers. But look at what the great drivers of this sport are struggling with, some of them. And if they're doing it, it's fair to say it could be happening up and down the grid. So maybe we give them a little bit more time to get to grips with it, to get their heads around it, to understand it, to develop a new style in themselves that then might get the best out of their cars. Mick Schumacher, though, I think he has great potential. I think he can be a great driver, and I look forward to the day when he's properly on song. But he's up against a good teammate in Magnussen, who seems to have found a way to adapt to this car a lot quicker, in the most part. Right, what we got? A couple of minutes. Right. Waldo says extract the performance from the car. Of course, that is the job of the team and driver. But as I said, it's not always that easy. It's not always that easy to happen straight away, and we have to understand that. And we can see that being demonstrated very, very clearly with the drivers at the front end. So, but shouldn't they have been practicing in the sim in the winter? Yeah, I mean, of course they practice in the sim. Of course they will have tried their best and be trying their best, and the sim can be quite valuable at times, but it's not a real racing car. Things like the tyre model are not exact. Certainly things like the porpoising, the bouncing, the new aerodynamic model won't yet be exact in the sim. So, you know, you can do what you like in the sim. It's a great tool, brilliant tool, but it certainly isn't as good as being in the real racing car. Right, quick one then before we go. Did I watch the Indy 500 quali? I didn't. I didn't have time, but no, I'm not an expert in Indy 500 or in Indy racing at all, but I'd love to get more into it, and I've been saying that for years. I just haven't had the time to do it. Maybe I'll try and watch. Right, one quick one before we go. Who's got a quick one? Okay, Will Vine says, will the new fat cars make Monaco even more boring this year? Well, they are heavier cars as well, which is a big issue around Monaco. What you really want in Monaco is a light, nimble car that you can throw around the corners quickly. But of course, everyone has the same. So I don't think it's going to affect the racing. I think Monaco is Monaco. We know what we're going to get. It's all about Saturday for me in Monaco. And look, that's fine. If all the focus comes down to that high pressure moment on a Saturday afternoon, I'm there for that. I want to see that. I'll be zoned in and watching that. Sunday is Sunday, and I will always watch it anyway to see what happens, but don't go into that Grand Prix expecting a dramatically different Monaco Grand Prix, because you're just not going to get it no matter which cars we go with. And that, folks, is that. Thank you so much. If you could just hit the like button on your way out, subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and I would just ask you, if you haven't yet seen my audio podcast, or listened to it rather, do go and check it out, please. It's called Pit Lane Life Lessons. I hope there's some value in it for every single one of you. It's me sharing my lessons that I've learnt through my time in this sport, from a privileged position on the inside of Formula One that I think you guys can all benefit from. Check it out, Pit Lane Life Lessons. I'd love to know what you think. Have a great week, folks, and I will catch you next time out post Monaco. Thanks very much. Ta-da.